It's the morning drive.
Good morning, and welcome to the Morning Drive. I'm your host, Brooks Fiesinger of BrooksFiesinger.com and MillionaireWho.com, where we help you stabilize your wallet, secure your future, and succeed in entrepreneurship and finance. I'm here with my co-host, Hyundai Sonata. Today, we're going to be talking about what is an asset. And before you turn this off, right, half of you are thinking, I don't care what an asset is, and the other half of you is thinking, of course I know what an asset is. Everybody knows what an asset is. So we're going to discuss for a minute, do you really understand an asset and the ramification of an asset? And then discuss, things that people think are an asset and really are not. And we're going to discuss things that you don't think are an asset and really can be. Which should be a pretty good conversation for this morning. So if you were to ask an accountant what an asset was, they're going to point to a balance sheet, and they're going to talk about, you've got assets and you've got liabilities. And an asset is going to be anything that, quote unquote, has value. So, if you want a loan, you can list things like your house. It's an asset. You can list things like your car as an asset. You can list things like your new guitar, or I've even heard people listing their clothes, as an actual asset with a bank. Now, why does a bank consider these things assets? Well, the reason why a bank is going to call them an asset, and they are an asset, is because they can be converted to cash. The idea being that, if you have a loan, for example, and you can convert some things that you have into cash, then that in theory lowers your risk on a loan, because you could convert to pay off the loan or pass off those assets that can be converted to cash, therefore to pay off the loan. So often when we're talking about assets, we're really talking about it as a leverage position for something such as a loan. And in those cases, you understand why a bank considers them an asset, because in theory, they can be converted to a cash. Now, there's some fundamental flaws with this concept of an asset, and that is often, how convertible to cash is it? Now, in the business world, we often use the terminology liquid assets and illiquid assets. And there's a whole lot of assets that really are not liquid at all, or very, very illiquid, as in they're very challenging to sell. I have gone through times in my life, especially since the Great Depression, many of you have, where a house could sit on the market for 2 months. If a house sits on the market for 2 months with 0 offers, is that a liquid asset or is that an illiquid asset, right? That becomes kind of a challenge. But whether we're talking about liquid or illiquid, we're still talking about this concept of being an asset, because it can be converted to cash. This brings the second and often larger issue that arises with things like houses and other assets, and that is how much is it actually worth? So, I've had an issue with my personal house, which I've talked to a banker about the value of it, and there's disagreement, right? They tell me based on their appraisal it's worth X, and I say it's worth Y. I had a similar issue with a car, and they sit there and say, look, your house is worth $500,000, and you can sell it for $700,000, right? Or sometimes it works the other way around. You say it's worth $500 and they say it's worth $700, right? So therefore they want it insured for $700,000. So that kind of thing. It's happened on both sides. And personally with cars, my insurance company wanted to insure my Ferrari for way more than it was worth. And I actually had to sign a stated value policy contract to insure less than they claimed it was worth. And the amount that they claimed it was worth was, frankly, way over market value. So, once again, that brings up the question of what is what is the value of something? What is something worth? I know people who will write the full purchase price of something on or as their asset value when they're calculating something like net worth, or they're calculating their assets for a loan situation or something like that. And it always raises that question of, just because you purchase something for a certain amount, can you sell it for that amount? And if the answer is no, then how much is that asset really worth? The value of those assets really is an opinion. And this can be very challenging because there's probably people out there sitting there and say, look, I've got $1 million net worth, and if they were to liquidate all their assets, they would have, $300,000, which is still better than a lot of people. It's still better than nothing. But it certainly raises that question because, how much are things worth? How much is an asset worth? How do we value assets? These are all real challenges and real problems. And it kind of goes back to that issue of, what is an asset and why do we measure assets? Now, a lot of people look at their asset value as the end goal. They sit there and say, hey, I'm a millionaire because I've got $1 million in assets. But a lot of those assets can actually be liabilities, right? So they can show up as an asset, you can state they're an asset, yet they cost you extensive amount of money to maintain, and they could never be liquidated for the stated value. I've always even thought something like that with Bill Gates. We talked about the net worth of Bill Gates being, billions and billions of dollars, and it was all because of his shares of Microsoft at one time. And I'm sure he's less invested in Microsoft today. But I always had a concern with that, even 15 years ago, because of the idea that he couldn't sell all his shares of Microsoft right now and get all that money. Because the minute he tried to sell all the shares of Microsoft, the stock would tank. Therefore, the value would decline. Now, for all practical purposes, it's pretty moot because once again, he's got no reason to sell $15 billion worth of stock. And even if he were to try to sell $15 billion worth of stock, he'd still become a very, very wealthy man in actual cash, not just net worth. But we've talked about in the past that no one's carrying around $15 billion, right? That money's not sitting there in cash because it's pretty foolish to do that. So everything's stored in some sort of asset of some sort, right? So it's either stocks, real estate, businesses, or something of those types. And that's kind of the situation with assets. So we like to talk about assets all the time. People talk about acquiring assets because on paper it makes them wealthy, but you could be, paper rich and wallet poor. And that's kind of a legitimate issue that happens in many cases, where there's been people who have actually gone bankrupt because they had plenty of assets, but they couldn't convert it to cash to pay off their debts. And that becomes a major issue. It brings up this concept of cash flow. So one of the biggest issues that I find with people that I work with and others I experience isn't asset value, it's cash flow. And what they end up doing is they have quote unquote banker assets, right? The things that they put on an asset column, but then they have liabilities such as loans and debt that requires regular payments. Those regular payments are an outflow of cash, right? So the cash, if I've got to pay $2,000 a month in payments, I have to pay out $2,000. It doesn't matter if I have $10 million in assets if I don't have the thousands of dollars necessary to pay this month's debt note, right? That's cash flow. I need to pay out X amount, therefore I need X amount to come in, therefore to pay it off. And this is where the asset thing becomes a challenge in the real world for a lot of you. And the problem is going to be, you buy yourself a house. Say you buy yourself a $500,000 house. Your $500,000 house is, you list as an asset, right? You sit there and say, this is great, I've got an asset. Now, the vast majority of you are going to have a mortgage on that asset. So therefore, even though you're sitting on a $500,000 house, you probably paid, maybe paid 3% down, maybe paid 20% down. Let's say you paid 20% down, so you put $100,000 down. You still have, you have a $500,000 asset, you have a $400,000 mortgage, and many of you are going to then say, well, I'm in positive equity. And positive equity means that the asset's worth more than the debt, which is good. You don't want to be a negative equity. You don't want the debt to be higher than the asset, which is a mistake a lot of people make. You always want to make sure your assets are worth more than than the debt. But even then, your assets worth more than the debt. You can sit there and say, hey, look, I've got $100,000 in equity in this loan. Isn't that wonderful? But you're still got a debt payment on that note. You got a debt payment for that mortgage. So that house that you're so excited about as being an asset costs you money every month, right? So this month, I'm not earning anything on it. I'm paying on it, and not only am I paying on it, I'm probably paying, say, $3,000 a month in payments. Plus, I have taxes. Plus, I have insurance. So, say it's costing me $4,000 a month. Okay. Now, on a balance sheet, I'm sitting there saying, "Look, I'm doing well. I've got a $100,000 asset." But the truth is, you've got the liability that you then have to own to, right? You've got to be paying the loan payments. You've got to be making those, payments every month. And if you miss the payments for a few months, guess what happens? That asset is all of a sudden going to be taken away from you. And so you can think for a minute, hey, I've got this asset, but you really don't. How many people do you know that actually own their houses? Very few. The vast majority of people, the bank owns their houses. And there's a number of people who are upside down on their home mortgages, which means their home is even worth less than they owe on it. So that should really make you think twice about the concept of being excited about this thing called an asset. And it brings up, there's a guy named Robert Kiyosaki, and Robert Kiyosaki is more confrontational than, or not confrontational, questionable than I realized. A lot of people doubt him. And, a lot of people have negative reviews of some of his books, like Rich Dad, Poor Dad, and they say things like, that he doesn't know what he's talking about, that he's, missing things, that, he does things wrong or whatnot. But there's a lot of people who swear by him as well and have a lot of positive things to say about Mr. Kiyosaki. There's a lot of things that Kiyosaki says that I don't agree with 100%. But frankly, I'm going to say things that you don't agree with 100%. That doesn't mean most of the ideas aren't valid. And so Kiyosaki's got a lot of ideas that I find a lot of value in. And one of them is what he kind of calls an asset. And he says an asset is really anything that brings cash in, and a liability is anything that takes cash out. And that is so true in practice, because what's ultimately important is cash flow, not what a bank sees on a balance sheet. And so this ends up being very important for this conversation, because technically you've got these things that I'll call quasi assets, because you can have a house and it can be a real asset to you and a value to you and an asset on your balance sheet. You can have you can have a lot of assets that are both an asset on the balance sheet and an asset in your life. You can often convert assets into cash. You can profit off of something somebody else does. You can create cash flow in areas that other people don't. And we'll talk about some of those in a minute. But in general, you've got to be careful when you call something an asset when it's taking money out of your wallet, right? If every month money's getting taken out of your wallet and you're getting nothing for it, it's a liability. If you're buying a house and renting it out to people and making cash flow money off of it, then it can be an asset. But if you're living in it and you're just spending money every month, that's a liability to you in your life. And it's true, right? And what I'll disagree is that the house isn't necessarily the liability so much as what's attached to it. So the taxes are your liability. The mortgage is a liability. Those things are all liabilities, and those are even liabilities on your balance sheet. But the kicker is that we don't tend to look at that piece of the puzzle, or we wash them out by talking about assets minus liabilities. So how much value is left at the end? And when we pay attention to that, that can become problematic. So Kiyosaki talks about an asset being anything that puts money in your pocket and a liability being anything that takes money out. And that is a concept that a lot of people can value, because buying a more expensive house and having a really expensive house that costs you money every month is not improving your financial situation. it's actually taking away from your financial situation, taking money out of your pocket. There's opportunity costs. You can't invest in other areas. You can't improve your life. It creates a problem every month because you've got to have that cash flow. It's sucking out cash flow like crazy. You got to make sure you have that cash flow. Again, there's a lot of people out there that are asset rich but wallet poor, and they struggle month to month to make the payments on something, to have some house that they can't enjoy because they're so stressed out trying to make the payments on it, right? I mean, what's the point of having a $500,000 house if you're stressed out over the payments every month because your cash flow negative and it's sucking everything out of you, right? What's the point of having it? It's not a benefit to your life. It's not an asset to your life. There's nothing positive of it to your life. It's destroying your life. It's a liability. It's a problem. Car loans are similar, right? You can list a car as an asset on your financial statement. But most people, I shouldn't say most people, that's a little bit of a fallacy. A whole lot of people have a car that is worth less than how much they owe on it. That means every single month they're paying on something that's not even worth what it shows on their balance sheet. Again, you can sit there and say, hey, I've got this monthly expense for transportation, but that's what it is. It's really a monthly transportation expense. It's not an asset. And maybe that monthly expense is less over time. And there's a lot of value plays in buying instead of renting or even taking out a loan. We can talk in the future about this concept of leverage. And I know a lot of very financially savvy people who will get massive loans out on things because they leverage that cash that they would have used to purchase it to invest somewhere else, right? So for example, if I'm seeing 20% returns in one spot and my car loan's 1.9, why don't I put the money in the 20% return and pay the debt note on the 1.9? But that's not how a lot of people think. A lot of people sit there and look at the monthly payments and they say, look, I can afford this monthly payment. And because I can afford this monthly payment, I'll do it. But can you afford that monthly payment, right? How can you afford to just open up your wallet and throw money out every month, right? That's a liability. Why do people just keep grabbing more and more liabilities? It's like they think that by buying expensive stuff, they're getting richer or they're showing their wealth. But really, all they're literally doing is digging a hole that they're gonna have to somehow get themselves out of and creating liabilities that are gonna choke them out for the rest of life, right? Why would you wanna choke yourself out? I think it's gotta be fallacies. It's gotta be people think, well, I'm gonna always make more money, or, I have better job security, or, I'll be able to cut things out later. They've gotta be telling themselves some lies in order to possibly justify the idea of creating more and more things sucking money out of your wallet. And we talked in the past, jobs aren't secure. No job is secure. Companies aren't secure. Your employment isn't guaranteed. What happens if next month you don't have any income or you add a big liability like a medical payment? Can you cover that cash flow requirement? Hopefully the answer is yes. But unfortunately to many of you, the answer is no, because you stacked up so many liabilities, and many of those liabilities you've convinced yourself are an asset. The bank's convinced you as an asset. The bank says, hey, you can write this off on your taxes, or hey, you can count this as an asset on your balance sheet when you're trying to get a loan. And so therefore we start to internalize that and sit there and say, okay, well, if that's an asset, I want an asset. Assets are good. They increase my net worth. And it's true, I think assets are good. But the important piece of it that tends to be forgotten is the issue of those assets being liabilities. And you've got to make sure you've got enough cash flow to cover liabilities. And while a house might in many ways be an asset, a house is also in many ways a liability. Because again, you're paying, it's taking money out of your wallet every month. And we have to be careful about things that take money out of our wallet every month. That's a negative cash flow situation. Negative cash flow situations mean, once again, you've got to pay for it every month. And while I understand why a lot of people do this, it's because they don't know any better, right? It seems so easy. They feel like everyone else does it. I can't tell you how many people tell me, oh, I bought a $40,000 car and I made payments on it because that's what everyone else does. No, they don't, right? Or, everybody gets a 3% down house loan. No, they don't. And they said, I can afford to make the payments. But can you? What do you mean you can afford? You can strap your life and ruin your life and not be able to afford to do things you want so that you can make a payment? The kicker is that if people understood how, I don't want to say easy, but how it's possible to actually buy assets that generate money, that are cash flow positive instead of cash flow negative, the world changes, right? I mean, just the idea that I can go buy a business or I can go buy a property and maybe I do spend $20,000 on it. And that thing gives me $100,000 a year back. And that $100,000 a year is consistently coming in every year. Instead of me paying interest, which means more money that costs to somebody, in order to get that asset, they pay me. Another thing Kiyosaki talks about doing is if you're going to take on the risk, you should be paid for it, right? When somebody insures you, you pay somebody for them to take on the risk. Why would you take on the risk and pay for that? Why would you pay to take a risk? It doesn't make sense. And that's what we're talking about. So really, technically a house is an asset. It can be used in many positive ways. It can be leveraged. It can be flexed. It's way better than just debt. Asset-backed debt is always going to be better than just debt. But it's not really an asset to you in your life. It's a liability to you in your life. And it's a liability because it takes money out of your pocket. Even if you pay it off in full, you are paying taxes every month or every quarter, every 6 months. You are paying insurance. You are paying maintenance, right? And maybe it's worth it to you. I'm not telling you not to own a house. I own a house. Maybe it's worth it to you to own the house. But it's worth it to own a liability. So keep that in mind. You bought a liability. You're not buying an asset. You're buying a liability that you enjoy. And I will never tell you not to buy an occasional liability that you enjoy as long as you can afford it and as long as it doesn't create cash flow problems. Okay? So you can buy that house. I'm not telling you not to, but don't think of it as a tremendous asset to your life, because it's not. However, your house is an asset. A house can be an asset. And I don't intend it to get into real estate too much in this conversation, but what I do want to point out with that concept is buying a house can be an asset if it creates cash flow. And a lot of people get into what they call the real estate market, right? And create positive cash flow out of buying houses, right? Maybe they buy a house and they rent it out. There's a lot of cool things that you can do with houses, such as leverage other people's money to create to buy a bigger asset than you could buy on your own. That's pretty cool. But the kicker is you still got to watch that cash flow piece, because with using other people's money means you're creating a liability. And while we just talked about how having an asset that's greater than a liability cost is a positive thing, but not everything, if you have an asset that's greater than the liability or somebody else is paying for the liability, right? So the cash is paying for the liability, then it becomes a wonderful investment, because again, you're not the one that's paying for that cash flow. Somebody else is paying for that cash flow. So if you have a renter and your payments on a house are $300 a month and they're paying $900 a month, and your upkeep expense and cost of low occupancy ends up being a total of $600, you're bringing $300 a month in positive cash flow out of that property. That's a great asset, right? And when you pay it off, unless you roll it over to a new property, which is a smart strategy, but even if you don't do that, right? Even if you don't do that, you pay it off, you're bringing in $600 a month in positive cash flow off your assets. Not paying $600 a month like you might be for your personal house, you're getting $600 a month. That's the kind of asset you want to deal with. That's the kind of asset that's going to improve your life big time. Now, one of the most interesting things I want to talk about here is that, what is an asset to one person might not be an asset to somebody else. I kind of first made a name for myself in cars, and I've got a book, Cars, the Ins and Outs of Buying and Selling, and I'll talk about that in more depth in a future episode. But I kind of made a name for myself with cars because everybody around me would say cars are an expense, cars are a liability. And I looked at them and said, why? I think cars are an asset. And again, this, common wisdom is that cars depreciate and that cars are awful investments. So if cars are an awful investment, why am I buying all these cars all the time, enjoying these cars all the time? Why am I driving BMWs, Mercedes, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? And every time I buy one, I'm either breaking even or profiting, right? Think about that. I could be making a profit off of the car that I'm driving. That's an asset. If I'm making money off the car that I'm driving, it's an asset. Now, there's a lot of ways that you can make, money off of it. You could use something like Turo, where you rent your car out. You could use something like Uber, where you use your car as an asset to earn extra income because you're driving other people around as a quasi taxi service. It could be that you use it for business purposes, and therefore you can use business cash flows to help pay for it. There's a lot of ways that you can create cash flow with a car. But the other thing is, just like others play the stock market, right? Many people buy stocks to sell stocks, to create profit, to create cash flow, to create revenue. When you buy stocks, you can buy dividend stocks to generate payments to you each month, or you can buy appreciation stocks where your goal is to buy a piece of the company and then sell it for more later. The same thing's true with cars. How does a car dealership work? A car dealership works by buying cars, marking it up, and reselling it with more value-added accessories and pieces, right? Therefore, they make a spread. The same car, a car dealership can actually make thousands and thousands of dollars off of because they buy it for less than they sell it for. They add stuff to it, maybe fix it up or add warranties or anything else to it to increase the values. And then after all that's said and done, they sell it for more to somebody, and they end up making a lot of money off it. It's an asset to the dealership. You can be the dealership, right? There's no reason, and I'm not talking about even flipping cars. I don't normally fix my cars. Sometimes I'll get one that has a simple problem that I need to fix. For example, I bought that truck for nothing that I had to clean a mass airflow sensor. It took me, 5 minutes and a $3 can of cleaner. I won't say I never do anything like that, but that's not my strategy. My strategy isn't to buy fixer-uppers. Some of you are going to sit there and say, I don't want to buy a fixer-upper. I don't buy fixer-uppers. I buy good cars, but I play the markets because I understand the markets. I understand how the world of cars works so well that I can look at any car, have an idea what it's worth this minute on different markets, and understand how to play those spreads. And the spreads could be as simple as, I can buy this on Craigslist and resell it on Facebook and get a 10% increase. That happens sometimes, right? Because different kind of buyers go to different places. Or it could be, this car is worth nothing right now, but it's going to shoot up in value in 6 to 12 months. Therefore, if I buy it now, I can actually sell it at a profit. I've worked with a number of classic car collectors who often go target cars at their lowest point in depreciation before they start appreciating. They sit there and say, look, I can pay $8,000 for this car. It's going to be worth $25,000 in 5 years. And so they go buy that car for $5,000, $8,000. Now, these situations, again, are treating cars like an asset, which is what the most important takeaway from this conversation really is. The conversation isn't that your house is always a asset or is always a liability, it's not an asset. It is, you got to question this conventional wisdom. What is an asset and what is a liability, right? Because some of the greatest things in life are that if you're smart and you think, things that other people consider assets are probably a liability. And if you think, things that people consider a liability can be an asset, right? So I can take something like a car, something that everybody else tends to say, that thing's an awful investment, it depreciates, and I can sit there and say, yeah, right, watch this. And I have done it over and over and over again, like clockwork. I have no problem buying and selling vehicles and profiting virtually every time. And the idea is, not that I go do some crazy negotiation and convince someone to do something stupid. It's I play the markets, right? I look for when people are selling certain vehicles cheap. I look for when people are going to, sell vehicles expensive or buy vehicles expensive. I know where each car is supposed to be sold. If you've got some super rare car, the place to sell it is probably not Craigslist, right? You got to go bring a trailer or Mecum auctions or something like that. So if I can go buy that on Craigslist and then go turn it around in an auction and sell it, I can make a huge profit. And so it ends up being a fun little hobby. So, I love buying and selling cars. I love my car hobby. And the reason why I love it is because I just love cars. I make a profit off of it, right? Like literally, I don't lose money on my cars like everybody else does. And that becomes awesome, right? I treat that asset as an asset, and other people won't call a car an asset, or a bank will call an asset that just, often your liability is higher than the asset. So it's a, upside down asset, right? So I bring this up, not that you have to get into cars, but the idea that anything can be an asset if you're smart. If you sit down and you really think about, what you're doing, and you understand a product or a area of the market, and you understand demand, you understand value, and you understand how cash flows. And that's the important thing. You got to understand how cash flows in something. If you understand how cash flows in an area like cars, then you can treat that as an asset, because you can take advantage of the direction those cashes flow. You could do that with real estate. You can do that with cars. You can do that with coins. You can do that with stamps. You can do that with baseball cards. You can do that with animals. You can do that with, almost anything. Almost anything can be a liability, and almost anything can be an asset, but you've got to be smart about it. And things like cars, most people, cars are a huge liability, and it slaughters, it steals from their wallet. They lose everything in a car. So, maybe my advice for them wouldn't be to go buy a Mercedes, right? But if you understand the way the markets work, and you understand the car market, and you understand when to buy and when to sell, and you understand geographical differences, that, this car is worth a lot more in the city than it is in the country, or worth more in the country than it is in the city, and you can buy where it's low and sell when it's high, then this traditional liability, this thing that other people shy away from, becomes an asset to you. And those assets are often the most valuable. The assets that nobody else can catch the value in, those that other people write off as a liability, are amazing assets to you. One of the things I love about cars is when I talk to people, they just assume they're gonna get hosed when they sell a car, right? So if they're not even trying to do well, if they're not even trying to break even, if they're not even trying to make a profit or to minimize their loss, and they're just, saying, hey, I'll pretty much take whatever I'm given, then that is a huge opportunity to get great deals. If they don't care how much money they make, then they're going to make a mistake and sell it for way less than they could. They're not going to take the time to research it. Most people don't take the time to research. Same thing with real estate and everything else. They don't take the time to really research when, how, where. Just being more knowledgeable and getting your education and financial education about what's going on can help you save money, limit your liabilities, increase your assets, and make more cash flow in a lot of these areas, right? You can create an asset in a place that other people don't. I know people have turned video games into assets and make money off of video games, right? People who do, I do the same thing with cars. My cars are an asset to me. I'm driving around in an asset, not a liability. I'm driving around in an asset. Most people are driving around liabilities. Why drive around in a liability when you can drive around in an asset? That's my take. Why live in a liability if you could live in an asset? The problem is a lot of the conventional wisdom isn't very wise. And we just assume that because a banker tells us or because somebody tells us that something's an asset or something's a liability, we accept it. We really need to challenge that convention and put some serious thought into it and say, is this an asset or liability? Does it take money from my wallet, or does it put money in my wallet? And then there's two things you can do with that, right? You can say, I want to avoid anything that takes money out of my wallet. Or we can say, how do we look at things that take money out of my wallet and turn them into things that put money into our wallet. And another great example of me thinking like that is I own a chain of dog daycares. And I kind of chuckle about it because I can't even tell exactly why I got into dog daycares, but I can tell you that I was paying for dog daycare services and I hated money coming out of my wallet for that service. If I buy one, now money comes into my wallet from that service. Think about that, right? Same thing. My dog goes to dog daycare, loves it. I can pay somebody for it, or I can get paid for it. It's the same service. But when I own it, I'm getting paid to have a dog daycare for my dog. Where before, I was paying to have a dog daycare for a dog. Asset or liability? Used to be a liability. Now it's an asset. My cars. If I sell it for more than it's worth every time, is that an asset or is it a liability? And some people ask me how I can afford to get to own so many cars and keep getting new cars. If you make a profit on each one of them, wouldn't you buy cars all the time? Right? Why not own cars all the time? Every time I buy and sell one, it helps me. The mentality of, you can't afford cars all the time is the mentality of I get hosed and lose money every time I buy a car. And that's not what we're talking about here, right? So figure out, how can you turn liabilities in your life into assets? What things do you consider an asset that are really a liability? And what can you do moving forward to get more things putting money into your wallet and have less things taking money out of your wallet? Now go out there and make the impossible happen.
Learn more at MillionaireWho.com.
It's the morning drive.